Hello, and welcome to Late Edition Crime Beat Chronicles. I'm your host, Nat Cardona. I'm happy to be back after a little bit of a hiatus here. The last time you listened, I introduced you to the unsolved case of the Cloverleaf Mall stabbings in Richmond, Virginia. This week, I'm talking with Richmond Times Dispatch opinion editor Scott Bass, who extensively covered the mall's fallout from the double homicide and the impact it had on the surrounding community. Tell me a little bit about yourself, your career now, and when you first laid your hands on this topic and coverage and what you were doing then, because I know it's like 15 plus years ago, right? As far as what you were writing.
It was a long time, right? I'm the opinion page editor at the Times Dispatch in Richmond. I've only been here for about a year. In essence, I've been a journalist in the Richmond area for almost 30 years. Yeah, almost 30 years. So I've just kind of jumped around from place to place. I worked in magazine journalism for probably the bulk of my career. Richmond Magazine, there was a publication here, an alternative weekly called Style Weekly, where I worked for about 10 years. Prior to that, I worked at the small daily out in Petersburg, Virginia, the Progress Index, for about 2 years. And then, oddly enough, I started my career as a business reporter for a monthly, then weekly business journal called Inside Business. And when the homicides took place in 96, I had just kind of started my career as a business journalist. Wasn't very good. Was still learning. So most of my focus was kind of on the development side of things. In this particular mall was the Richmond area's first sort of regional shopping destination. It was a regional shopping. We didn't have anything like it. And it kind of replaced, in the Richmond area, in a lot of cities, right? The main shopping district was downtown. In Richmond, it was Broad Street. And Broad Street had the Miller Roads. It had a big Tallheimers, big, beautiful department stores. It's where everyone kind of collected during the holidays. It was the primary sort of retail shopping district. And then somewhere around, starting in the mid-50s, early 60s, shopping malls started to replace downtown retail districts as not white flight, but as sort of the great suburban explosion took place after World War II. Everyone moved out of urban areas into the suburbs, and the retail sort of followed that. And Cloverleaf Mall was our first sort of big regional shopping destination that was outside of East Broad Street downtown.
Kind of a big deal.
Yeah, we were a little late. Like Richmond is always kind of late to things. So, this opened the first mall, Cloverleaf opened in 1972. But right about this time, within 3 or 4 years, several malls have been kind of were built. Right after right after Cloverleaf Mall was built in 72, Regency Mall, which was a bigger, much nicer facility. It was 2 stories. That was built in 74 or 5. Okay. And then oddly enough, Cloverleaf, which is located south of Richmond in Chesterfield County, which is sort of the biggest jurisdiction in our metro region, opened a second mall much further down about 3 miles down the road from Cloverleaf, where there was nothing. It was a little tiny shopping strip with one anchor, and it did no business for several years. They used to call it the Chesterfield Morgue. But it's interesting because, just as an aside, mall development really took off in the 50s after Congress kind of passed the law basically making it, allowing developers to depreciate real estate development really, really quickly. And that was in 54. And that just jump-started mall development. And all of a sudden, there was an explosion. Malls were built literally all over the country because it was very easy for developers to build a mall and get their money back, pay it off within a few years. independent of how the mall actually was doing from a retail perspective. So it just led to a proliferation of malls. And that's kind of what happened to Cloverleaf. Cloverleaf was the first, but there were several others that had built up not far away, and slowly but surely it started to eat Cloverleaf's lunch. Because Cloverleaf was sort of on the edge of Richmond, or just across the border in Richmond, in Chesterfield from Richmond. And there's an interesting racial history to, obviously, in Virginia, we have independent cities, which means that our cities are actually, they have separate government from the counties next to them. Whereas if you go in everywhere else in the country, cities are tended to be centers of commerce that are part of another jurisdiction. In Virginia, we have independent cities, which means they have no connection whatsoever to the municipalities around them, which meant that in order for the city to grow, it had to annex the surrounding jurisdictions and its property residents. And this had been going on in Virginia, through the first part of the 20th century. One of the last big annexations, and I think it might have been the last one, was the city of Richmond annexing about 23 square miles of Chesterfield County in 1970. Chesterfield County is just south of the city, sort of south and east. And they basically absorbed 23 square miles and about 47,000 or so residents. Understanding that there was a racial backdrop here, because this came a few years after desegregation. Richmond was sort of ground zero in massive resistance to segregation of integration of schools. And once that happened in the 60s, there was a lot of white flight out of Richmond. White folks just left, and they moved into Chesterfield and Henrico and some of the surrounding jurisdictions. This sort of last gasp for Richmond to sort of maintain some of its tax base occurred in 1970 with the annexation, but it was also an attempt to sort of bolster sort of the white political structure, because most of the residents that they absorbed were white. They were beginning to lose their political power, and that was a primary motivator for the annexation. The mall was built by Chesterfield County as kind of a big FU to the city of Richmond. It's like, okay, you took our land, you took our residents, and we're going to build this big fancy mall, and we're going to suck all the retail dollars out of the city into Chesterfield County. That's the way a lot of people read that. So it has an interesting history there. The location was just across the city border, the border with Richmond and Chesterfield. They wouldn't even allow buses to venture into Chesterfield County, because the idea was, if we allow buses to come into the county, we're going to be allowing Black folks to come here. And no one wanted that, because there was, there was this perception that once Black residents moved into Chesterfield County, then, everything was lost. This was a difficult time for the Richmond region from a racial perspective. It was not a healthy time or a place. So the mall had always had sort of this slight stigma attached to it in that regard. But in the very beginning, Cloverleaf Mall was really the center of fashion for a couple of years in Richmond. Everyone coalesced there. Our local department stores, which had stores all up and down the East Coast, Thalheimer and Millen Rhodes, that were founded here. Thalheimer was there. Millen Rhodes came a little bit later. Richmond really was, for a period of time, kind of a center of retail innovation. This was in the 70s, 60s and 70s. A lot of the big format, big box stores kind of came out of Richmond. Circuit City, Best Products. Back in those days, they were the kind of the first to actually do big box retail. So it was an interesting time and an interesting place for Richmond because we had this history of sort of retail innovation on the East Coast and in the South. And the mall came along. It was a brand new concept, and everyone flooded to the mall. That lasted for a few years until the other malls started showing up and duplicating those efforts, and it just kind of splintered the market. The homicides came, I guess it was 96, so several years later. The mall was in decline, had been for several years as the sort of suburban development really took off in Chesterfield further out, where around that other mall that they had built in that direction. So the mall, Cloverleaf Mall, was in decline and had been struggling. They had struggled to keep their department stores. They would leave. They would have new ones come in. It was difficult. But during the early 90s, things really started to take a turn. Richmond at that time was becoming known as one of the murder capitals of the U.S. during the crack cocaine epidemic. And a lot of people in the surrounding jurisdictions kind of looked at Richmond as this dangerous place to be, and it was drug infested. You didn't want to go into the city, and Cloverleaf kind of was right on the edge, and people kind of associated Richmond with Cloverleaf on some level. So it was in decline. People began to view Cloverleaf as a dangerous place or potentially a dangerous place. And then when the double homicides took place in 96, that was kind of the end of it. A lot of the tenants at the mall decided not to renew their leases. The decline just accelerated. And that was, I think most people who are here in Richmond, who recall this time period, would agree that that double homicide was kind of the nail in the coffin for Cloverleaf Mall, for lack of a better word.
Sure. We need to take a quick break, so don't go too far.
Experience the life-changing benefits of automated insulin delivery with the T-Slim X2 insulin pump from Tandem Diabetes Care. Snack while you meal prep, doze off on the couch, wear it fashionably or discreetly. You can do it all with the #1 rated automated insulin delivery system according to a DQ&A patient panel. Get started at tandemdiabetes.com. RX only, indicated for patients with type 1 diabetes 6 years and older. Warning, Control-IQ technology should not be used by people under age 6 or who use less than 10 units of insulin per day or who weigh less than 55 pounds. Safety info available at tandemdiabetes.com/safety-info.
If you wanna go, I'm down.
During your coverage of that and the decline and talking in the 90s, do you have any recollection of like what else was going on there? I mean, goofy things happen when there's like vacant stores and that kind of thing.
I mean, there had,
but like what? What was going on inside? Aside, I mean, murders aside, like as far as trouble, whatever you want to label it as.
There have been some reports of, teenagers walking around the mall intimidating, the shoppers, that kind of thing. The mall had changed in terms of the retail mix. So as it became less of a destination and other malls had kind of cornered the market in more populous areas, the demographics around Cloverleaf were lower income. There was a higher Black population, a higher Latino population, and you started to see a change in retail mix. So you didn't have some of the higher end retailers or the big chains had already kind of vacated. So the Gaps, the Limited and those kinds of stores had kind of had left the place. So you ended up with smaller stores that didn't quite fill the spaces that had been originally, it was designed for a larger footprint. And it created more vacancies. And it became a place where, people kind of viewed, the mall is the low income, mall for people who don't have as much money. And the clientele kind of matched that. And that's the way a lot of people viewed Cloverleaf. But the vacancies were there. I mean, I don't know that it was anything I don't recall any other major episodes. There have been, I think, another, every now and then there'd be a report of someone who had been, a fight or a shooting or something like that, but it wasn't
Thanks for clarifying that. Yeah, I
place
just
of
didn't know if there was like
crime.
other stuff going on there, or it's more just like, we don't go there because it's more.
That's what made this case so bizarre, is because it was it was a, I think they were both stabbed at least 10 times from what I recall. And they couldn't quite figure out sort of, well, was this someone who was just passing through? Because it was kind of it was right off of Chippenham Parkway. It was close to the interstate. Could this been someone who was just passing through? Were they looking to rob? Who knows? But the fact that they were stabbed multiple times kind of raised the question of it seemed personal. There was nothing. They scoured. The police really did put everything into this, as far as from what I recall, and they just kept coming up empty. They couldn't. Every lead that they had, there was a U-Haul at one point in the parking lot that had been left unlocked with the lights on, I think, and that turned out to not be connected. They just kept running into dead ends, and yeah, it's just bizarre. No one really ever. I don't think that. I suspect today they're not any closer than they were.
Whatever happened in 2004 as a possible break in the case or lead, obviously fizzled out, and it's been there almost 20 years since. So, yeah, it's definitely really
more than 20 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, from 2004 for there to be like this possible break, but that was like the last that we've seen.
Right.
That's.
And the mall's completely gone. Now they tore it down. Obviously, you know that.
Well, right. So 1996, November 1996, these murders happened. Your One Style Weekly article that I first came across was, 8 years later in 2004. So when you were covering that, where was the mall at that time? Was it about like literally on its last legs, or?
Yes, it was literally on its last legs. In terms of, gosh, I can't recall who was actually, if one of the department stores was even still there.
Oh, wow.
Sears might have still been there in 2004.
Okay.
But I believe they were the last anchor. But yeah, at that point in time, a lot of it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. Chesterfield County had pegged it for redevelopment a few years earlier. Mm-hmm. And, if you spend enough time talking about the mall being dead to your constituents in the news and with plans of what we're going to do to fix it, it kind of seals it. In the mall, by 2004, it was done.
Okay.
It was just a matter of who was going to pay for the redevelopment.
Sure. And then as an aside to that, on the fringe, it really could never shake that this is the place where 2 women were murdered and they still don't know what happened. True?
Yeah, no, absolutely true. There was a real estate agent or a commercial real estate broker who followed all of this with me in a story that I wrote. He made the comment that, that mall's got death written all over it. And that was really true. Like, no one wanted to touch the mall. You couldn't get good tenants to re-sign. It just had this perception of being in a bad area. There's some racial undertones to it, of course. But by that point, it was so far gone that I don't think anyone reasonably thought it could be resurrected as a retail destination.
Sure. And then, do you have any idea how long that all-in-one dollar store where they were murdered at, like how long did that survive? Any clue?
After they were murdered?
Yeah.
I don't. It might not have reopened.
Okay.
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to. Have you tried to talk to Jay Lafler?
I know that the feelers have been out with that. He would probably have more insight on that, right?
He's a great interview.
Yeah.
And he actually did 2 stints there. So I thought he was the original mall manager, but he came in, I think, 75 or 76 or somewhere in there. He came a couple of years after. Then he left and then came back. And he was the manager at the mall when the homicides took place.
Yeah, and it was like a really crazy time period, right? Like he just returned 5 weeks before or something.
He hadn't been there long, and they were in the process of trying to revive it. So he worked for, I think, Simon Property Group, which is they either just purchased the mall or, I believe it. I'd have to go back and check, but yeah, he was with a group that had taken it over, and they had hopes of sort of reviving it. And then that happened, and changed those plans.
So, right. So what's there now?
They have this sort of mixed use thing. It's there's a big Kroger, one of the biggest. There's nothing exciting there. They basically replaced it with a mix of retail and residential. And the Chesterfield County had gotten involved and helped issue bonds to kind of pay for some of the infrastructure, and got Kroger to build, I think at the time, and it might still be, one of the biggest Krogers in Virginia. I mean, it's just massive Kroger marketplace, and that was the big anchor.
Okay.
Interestingly, there is one little remnant of the mall still left, which is a tire shop that was part of the mall. And it still has the old 60s and early 70s sort of architecture that refused to sell. And it's still there. And it's right in the middle of this sort of new development that they put in, kind of sticking out like a sore thumb. It's
I can appreciate
Firestone tire place. Yeah, it's exciting. But they're in the process of redeveloping the whole area now. There's some stuff going. They're putting in a couple of ice skating rinks across the street, and there's a big sort of office park that had been there for years. They're trying to interconnect the office park with a shopping district / entertainment complex right next to it that's close to the mall.
Mm-hmm. This is like anywhere. Pop that in any city kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's not much different.
Right. Well, what's the demographics in the area now?
It's still primarily, it's not a high income, the area of Chesterfield. Chesterfield's big, it's about 400 square miles. So it's a big footprint. The sort of as the suburban development kind of shifted further out, those sort of inner edge parts of both counties, there's Chesterfield and Henrico, kind of,
The one last thing that pops in my mind here is, I know you weren't a crimes reporter and you are not one currently, but just for more context, because I'm not there, and I know that Richmond was at one time, the murder capital, like you say. Are there more cases like this? Like, I guess it's interesting to me that there's so little coverage of an unsolved murder of 2 women at a mall, something so public and, seemingly random. And it's just like, is this kind of one of those earmarked cases in the area that people like definitely know, definitely remember? Like, or are there like tons of these? I just don't get it.
I think at the time, to be just what I remember of this time period, Richmond was, I think 2 years earlier, we had 160 murders in the city. This was a city of less than 200,000 people.
Okay.
It was a problem. We had a higher murder rate. So it didn't happen often in Chesterfield, the jurisdictions around the city. Mm-hmm. We've always had issues, but not 160 murders a year. So when the Cloverleaf murders happened, I think it just kind of got lost a little bit. It was like, okay, there's a racial element to it. If it were 2 white women, then there would be way more attention focused on it. That's just tends to be the case. And because these were minority women who were found stabbed to death in a mall that people had stopped caring about, at least those with political power had stopped caring about, allowed it to sort of just kind of drift. We have quite a bit of that here. It's unfortunate.
Yeah. Is there anything else you just want to add about your realm of things in connection with Cloverleaf?
Yeah, I hope it's enough for you to sink your teeth into. And I guess not having a lot of information about the actual case itself. I know Chesterfield was very close to the vest about what they would release. The police department was. So I recall just kind of during when I was reporting on this, just kind of banging my head up against the wall because they wanted this to be out there, but it was very difficult to get them to talk about some of the leads that they had and didn't have and all that good stuff. I think for me, just going back and looking at the case itself, I was always fascinated with it. I mean, I'm a local, journalist, so outside of Richmond, maybe you wouldn't care about such things, but there's so many different layers to it. Understanding like the connection between annexation and sort of the racial history. There was always like another layer to it that maybe like I didn't think about or didn't realize until I went back and looked at everything again.
And that's all for now. Subscribe so that you don't miss what's coming up next. New episodes and new cases are coming your way.